2 Samuel. We're going to spend the entire time in 2 Samuel, going from chapter 3 to chapter 20. You may have noticed that in 2 Samuel, the chapters got increasingly larger. And so we don't go through as many chapters this week as we have in the past, and that's because the storylines are just longer, a lot of detail. You can see that whoever is writing 2 Samuel is probably not Samuel, because Samuel is dead. But the stories are more detailed, and you just see really what plays out is a story as you go through the life of David. It's an interesting thing to read through. In fact, maybe you got caught up into it and you're reading into it, maybe even imagining what it might have been like, and it's kind of like a soap opera being played out. So in 2 Samuel chapter 3, we're going to get right into it. We see that David it really starts out in chapter 3 talking about the wives of David, that David had a number of wives that he is now marrying. And even though he has all these wives and sons from these wives, and keep in mind, if you remember back in the area of the law, when we were going through that, we're not seeing multiple wives until we get to this place and in the history of Israel. And people are like, well, why was he this godly king, and yet he was doing a lot of things at this time that weren't really in the law? And I think there was a lot of ignorance of the law. We have a little idea of that today, that there's an ignorance to the Word of God, and we're doing a lot of things that bring destruction, and then we blame God for it. David marries, he is a king. What do kings do? They make alliances with other kingdoms, and they do that by marrying multiple wives. He comes into being king already with 2 wives, and separated from his first wife, which would have been the third. And what's interesting, in chapter 3, David wants Michal back. And when the southern kingdom, Judah, and Israel, the northern kingdom, which Saul was ruling in that northern kingdom, the house of Saul was ruling the northern kingdom. The southern kingdom went to David at the death of Saul. David took the kingdom of Judah. And there was a period of about 7 years where Saul's house ruled the northern kingdom and David ruled the southern kingdom. And when Abner, who was loyal to Saul and then loyal to his son, said, and his son was very weak. Saul's son was very weak. Abner was really running the northern kingdom. When he actually had an encounter with one of Saul's concubines, and Ishbosheth, Saul's son, said, "What are you doing? You're not supposed to be sleeping with the king's concubines." And Abner gets offended. He says, "Who am I, a dog?" And he goes to David and he says, "I am no longer going to be loyal and faithful to him." And really, Abner turns over the kingdom, the general turns over the kingdom to David. And if you keep in mind, Abner, who was the general of the northern kingdom, Joab was the commander of the southern kingdom. So Abner was the commander of the armies of the northern kingdom, and Joab of the southern kingdom. And Abner's the one that killed Joab's brother. And so there's a little bit of vengeance going on there, and you'll see that in a short time, actually in chapter 3. So Abner comes in peace, says, "I will hand over the kingdom to you." David says, "Thank you, I receive that, we'll go forward with this." And then he sends Abner in peace. Just about that time, Joab comes. Abner's already along the way. Joab comes along, hears that Abner's been there, and he tries to give some reason of, well, he's trying to set us up. He really doesn't want to have peace. He's just checking out the kingdom. And then without David said he's come with peace. The command is that you do leave him alone. And Joab doesn't do that. He takes men, he chases him down, and then eventually he stabs Abner and kills him because of the vengeance he was dealing with still with his brother that was killed by Abner. And really, Abner's he really responded in self-defense. If you remember, Joab's brother was chasing Abner, trying to kill Abner, and Abner basically just killed him to get him to stop chasing him. So Joab and his brother are really becoming a thorn in David's flesh. He really can't get rid of them because they control the armies, and yet they only obey the commands of David that they want to command, the commands they want to obey. And we're going to see this as we go through the chapters, that even though David is a great king, and most of it makes it appear as though David was in control, and he was, Joab did not fear David, and the sons of Jeriah did not fear him. And then at that point, after some time, the united kingdom of the north and the south took longer to come together because Joab put it into jeopardy. And the only thing that saved it was that David, the king, wept and mourned over the death of Abner, and the northern kingdom loved David for his response to the death of Abner and to his frustration with Joab. So Ishbosheth was killed by two trusted brothers in the kingdom, and the brothers should have seen the handwriting on the wall. They went in while he slept. They killed Saul's son, the one that was remaining. And then they go back to David, and they're hoping to get some reward. And I don't know why they didn't see the handwriting on the wall. David had ended the life of anyone who would kill God's anointed, the king. And so they both lost their life because they had killed one of Saul's son. I think this comes back to this point of realizing that I think David truly loved Saul, and he loved his family. And I think David wanted to be king and was anointed by Samuel to be king, but he was also embracing Saul's family. Even though they chased them, Saul chased them, even though his life was constantly threatened, even though Michal lived her life with another man, there was this drawback, and that's what she wanted. He wanted Michal, the daughter of Saul, to come to his house and to be in his home. He wanted to be part of the family. He didn't want to be left out. And so if you're watching right now, just let us know you're here. You can ask some questions. We would love to hear any questions you might have as we go through this. There's a lot to go through. We're in the time period of about 1055 to about 1015 BC. And David was about 30 years old when he was made king of all of Israel. And the first thing he did was he attacked the Jebusites who were living in Jerusalem. If you remember back when he was with Goliath, he had already went there through the head of Goliath over the wall, almost as a statement to say, I'm coming for this city. He had selected the city. He would have lived not far from it in Bethlehem. And so he would have seen the hills of Bethlehem. You would have been able to see the hills of Jerusalem. It's right there. Still today, you can kind of see that. And his first campaign, once united, when the northern and the southern kingdom were united, was to attack the Jebusites. And what's interesting is the Jebusites had a walled-in city, the city of David, which, by the way, the city of David really wasn't part of the now walled-in city of Jerusalem. When you go there, the city of David is actually not even uncovered. They're excavating it even right now, where his palace would have been down the hill of the Kidron Valley. There's a model in Jerusalem you can see that shows the city of David, what was the original, and then when the temple was put in, how it evolved. Like a lot of cities do, around the temple, but in the opposite direction of the city of David. And so when you go there, a lot of it isn't even uncovered right now, what David would have conquered. What's interesting is the Jebusites mocked David and Israel. Israel under King Saul was not seen as a powerful nation or a threat. They really were seen as novice people. I mean, their God did incredible things, but they really didn't, because they were never united. I think a lot of these nations that lived among the nation of Israel kind of laughed at the disunity of Israel. The cities that called themselves Israelite cities, they were intermixed with other cities. There's a lot of intermarrying going on. And so there's not really clear lines in the nation of Israel. And now David comes with this united kingdom. And I don't know that the Jebusites really believed David was going to be any different than King Saul. And Saul was never able to remove them from Jerusalem either. But David goes there and they mock them and say, laugh at them, and they there's all kinds of things that they tell them. But David ends up conquering the city through the shafts, the Hezekiah's tunnels, and they enter through the water shafts to get into the city, and then they destroy the city. Now, Jerusalem, or at least the original area of Jerusalem, which would have been the city of David, was called the city of David because he conquered it and he put his palace there. And it was from the time of David until even now, if there were a king, it would be in Jerusalem. It's why many people argue that Tel Aviv should not be the capital of Israel, that it should be in Jerusalem. And what's interesting is foreign kings, after hearing David's first campaign and victory, there were foreign kings that came and supplied David to build the palace and to help him build up the city. So there were other nations that wanted to support David, that appreciated David, that saw his leadership and saw the strength of David and wanted to be friends with the kingdom of Israel and not enemies. And when David gets there, what's interesting, David gets there, and David, what does he do? When he becomes king, figure out how to solve world peace and figure out, no, he takes on more concubines and more wives. It's an incredible thing. He's starting to build his own kingdom with his own family. And it sounds like David is watching other kings and kind of following the example of kings. So when David becomes king, he's loyal to God, but he's also taking on maybe some of the example of the kings around him, and maybe not fully committed to understanding what that does when you bring in so many wives into the kingdom of Israel, and that's what he did. What's interesting is his first battle was with the Philistines, and the Philistines, they were friends with David, and they're not friends with David. David was going to fight with them, and now David's the king of Israel. David apparently hated Israel, and now he's their leader, and he loves Israel. One of the first battles David comes to is a memorable one, because this battle occurs, and God says, I'm going to go fight with you, and I'm going to go before you. And it's with the Philistines, and they have a massive group of people, and David prays, and God tells David, you are to do exactly what I'm telling you. Now, Saul had the same situation, and he didn't obey. David, however, is someone who obeyed God when he spoke to him, and David says, fine. They go in front of these balsam trees, and the Lord says, when you hear the wind in the top of the balsam trees, that is the sound, even though you won't see him, of the Lord going before you. And he is going to go in the battle and defeat the Philistines, and you're to come with him, participate with him to win the battle. This is a reoccurring theme throughout the Old Testament and New Testament. Not that God is going to fight all the battles. We say God's going to fight all our battles. God will fight all our battles. God will fight all our battles. Really, what's happening is God wants us to fight with him. Everything he does on this earth, he wants to do with us. God never uses anyone. He does it in participation. Whenever you do something like work or you pray or you do an activity that's fun, when you're doing it with each other, you're participating together, it causes your relationship to come together and for there to be intimacy and memories that are being made. And God wants to make memories with David in the kingdom of Israel. He wants to wow them when they're in it, like, yeah, we went after the Philistines. We heard this noise in the top of the balsam trees, and then the wind came through, and then all the Philistines started almost killing themselves, and then all of a sudden something else happened, and we came up and we cleaned it. Yeah. And they did it with God. And when they came back, they were talking about the incredible help that the Holy Spirit at that time would have given them as they went into battle. So we move on to chapter 6, and David wanted the Ark of the Covenant with him. And now this is an amazing thing. David becomes king of Judah. The Ark isn't there. Somewhere this Ark is left, and there's hearing, David especially is hearing how where it's at, the house where it's at is being blessed over and over again. And so he wants to bring the presence of God, the Ark. Could you imagine having the Ark of the Covenant in your house? You know, at that time, that Ark was created and put into an inner court of the tabernacle, and no one was supposed to go in there. And if you did, you were to be purified, and you were to be, you were to made prayer. And if you didn't, they had bells on their ankle and they would be dragged out. And now the Ark of the Covenant is in someone's house, maybe even in a barn. I mean, the total disregard for what was established with Moses, and it was just left in the house. King Saul had literally disregarded this ark, which to him was nothing more than a relic. But David recognized the importance of the ark, and he said, we need to bring it back and restore the order for which Moses had established hundreds of years before this, and put it back in a tabernacle. And there should be a place where people can come and meet with God. So he's celebrating on this journey, and they bring it. Of course, you know the story. They put it on a cart, new cart with some oxen. The oxen stumble. The ark starts to fall. Uzzah, whatever you want to call his name, reaches out to grab it and is struck dead. Of course, David is just crazy. Like, what's going on? Why we're trying to bring the ark back? Like any of us would do. You just begin to like, what in the world is going on? And they bring the ark, and then a man dies, and David leaves it. He pouts. And he's like, well, if that's how you're going to treat it, God, then that's what we're going to do. And so he leaves it there, but not for long. He begins to long for the ark to be in the city of David, to be where he's at. And so David goes back. He has men carry it, how it's supposed to be carried. And he begins to worship, and they make sacrifices. He brings the priests who are supposed to handle it, the tribes that are supposed to handle the presence of God. And he goes back and he studies how it's supposed to be brought. And the ark, which is a blessing because it's the presence of God. And the presence of God is a blessing in the home where it resides. I think this is so important on a practical level, that when we have the presence of God in our home, there will be blessing in our home. I think we underestimate the importance of it, even as we'll get to this even later. But hell, I think when we think of hell, we think of all of the torturous things that hell will be. You know, it's a bottomless pit. It's going to be stinky, like burning sulfur. It'll be worms eating your skin. I mean, all of the ways the Bible describes what hell is. But I think we often overlook the worst of all the tortures of hell, and that is the absence of God. That God's presence is not there. And we live in his presence right now. Whether you're a believer or not, you're like the wheat and the tares. We live in his presence. And you can think, because you don't believe in God, well, hell is going to just be like this. And it won't, because the things that make this work for you and enjoyable for you will all be gone. And all you'll have left is destruction, right? The presence of God will be gone. And I think we lose sight of how important, and David understood this, the presence of God was in the capital city of the kingdom of Israel. And David, it's interesting, they would sacrifice, and he began to dance, and he began to sing, and Michal, the daughter of Saul, is watching him. If you go to verse 16 of chapter 6, he says, as the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, watched from a window, and when she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, look what it says, she despised him in her heart. She's like, how embarrassing. Remember who her father was. He did not value God's word. He did not worship God. He was king without a heart that was loyal to God. So she saw what it was to be king when you don't worship God. And David is demonstrating a king that understood that he was only king by God, for God, and in doing his work on earth. And he's showing the people how to worship them. And there's this song that we used to sing, I'll be yet more vile, says Michal to David, or David to Michal. If you go to verse 20, it says, when David returned home to bless his household, Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, how the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, disrobing in the sight of slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would do. She despised him. She attacked him. He is the king. And she comes at him and just mocks him and treats him horribly. And David said to her, it was before the Lord who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house when he appointed me ruler over the people of Israel. I will celebrate the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. But by these slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in honor. And Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. She was barren. See, life comes from God, and she was barren not only in her womb, but in her spirit, because she did not view God the way David did. She viewed God the way Saul did. And I think we all need to come to a place of recognizing how important the presence of God is, the presence of God. So David, he now has the Ark of the Covenant, and David says, I'm in a palace, and the Ark's in a tent. And he says, I want to build something for God, the presence of God. David wanted to honor the presence of God. And God says to him, David, did I ask for this? I will determine where I live. I don't need you telling me where I will be. But he said, because of your heart, verse 16 of chapter 7, he says this. He says, your throne will be established forever. And David realized the significance of it. And he comes back to the Lord and in a humble and a very gracious way. And he thanks God because he realizes in that moment every blessing in his life. And stop for a moment. Think of every blessing in your life. Is the only time we celebrate God for the blessing in our life at Thanksgiving? Or is it a daily celebration of what God did? The difference between Saul and David is he celebrated God because he recognized that not only did God spare his life through all the years that Saul was chasing him, the king anointed by God was chasing him to kill him and to spare his life. I mean, when it was his enemy, he could go attack attack the enemy and destroy them like he did Goliath. But when it came to Saul, the threat that would come after him, and he couldn't end the threat because he couldn't kill Saul. He couldn't touch Saul. He had to lean completely on God. And now he's sitting not only as king of Israel, the kingdom has now come together to follow him. He now has a palace. He has alliances with kingdom, stuff that Saul had never done. Now the Ark of the Covenant is there, and he wanted to build this place for him. And God's like, not quite, but listen, David, your kingdom will not end up like Saul's, for your kingdom will go on forever and ever and ever. And so David starts to fight the kingdoms that are all around him and that are not allies and are threats. And he conquers every one of them. And they take the vast plunder from these battles. And very quickly, year after year, the kingdom of Israel's becoming now more of a nation. The borders are beginning to be formed with David. So whereas with Saul, there were a number of cities in the kingdom of Saul that were like, there weren't natural necessarily borders. The tribes of Israel had these cities, and they were a nation among all these other nations around them, which was like city-states all around them. And now David is starting to form the boundaries of the nation of Israel. And the fame of David is growing, as we see in verse 13 of chapter 8. People are starting to know who he is. It says, and David became famous after he returned from striking down 18,000 Edomites in the Valley of Salt. And so they conquered these areas. And David, it says in verse 15 that he has this very talented cabinet of commanders, leaders, people that are helping him run the nation of Israel. So it's not just David, it's very gifted, a team of people that are working to accomplish and succeeding at what they're doing. And as they're doing it, in the midst of everything that David is accomplishing, he stops and remembers people. This is one thing you got to look at David and go, wow. David was a very successful king, but he remembered his covenants and he remembered people. He didn't leave them behind. And what was amazing about David was he remembered Jonathan and his affection for the family of Saul. And David's heart said, he says, I'm looking for someone to bless from the house of Saul. And they find this Mephibosheth, and son of Jonathan, which I think is an interesting name. I think they gave him that name to make it difficult for all of us to try to pronounce. But they bring him in. Now, if you remember, this is the son, when Saul died, they rushed out. The woman who was caring for him fell. He became paralyzed, and they carried him, and he's been paralyzed since this point. And they bring him in, and David bowed to him, gives him back all of his family's land, and says, you will always eat at my table. Again, not only showing that David honored his covenant with Jonathan, but David also loved the family of Saul, and he shows it again and again. And the servant of Saul that was faithful to Saul, he says, you will care for his land. His name was Ziba, and we'll find later Ziba becomes very loyal to David. You really do reap what you sow. What goes around does come around. And then it says that Mephibosheth has a son, which is Micah, and just mentions his name, that the family of Saul does go on, although the curse of Saul follows it. Now we're in chapter 10, and what's interesting here is when you look at this chapter, you'll discover how important the people you listen to are. David is in his palace. He gets word that the king of the Ammonites, who is his friend, dies. And he sends a delegation of dignitaries to go to his son, the son of king of the Ammonites who died, and let him know that we feel bad. They bring gifts, and and that were mourning, and they come to just let him know that we're sad of what happened with your father. Well, this king's son has advisors, and the advisors tell him the only reason David came was he's spying out the land. Now that this king, your dad, is dead, he's going to attack you and take your land. That was not David's heart. Of course, the son apparently doesn't know David and understand David's heart. And so they stop this delegation of men who are very respectable, honored men in the kingdom of David. That's who he sent to this king. He would have done that to show his true concern for the situation. They take the delegation and mistreat them. They shave half their beard and then take their clothing and cut it around their buttocks, and which would have been an incredible sign of disrespect. And they said, the reason you do that is because he's coming to destroy you. So do this to that delegation and send them back. Now, I don't know where the wisdom in that comes from. They're not sure they're not certain. This king's not certain what David is going to do. One thing is for sure, if you do that to his delegation, they most certainly are going to come back. If they came to spy the land out, they spied the land out. There was no wisdom in the advice this young king received, and because of that, he did something foolish, and it ended up being a prophetic event. See, sometimes when you get bad advice, that bad advice is almost prophetic. The advice you're getting leads to what you're fearing the most. This young king listened to the wrong people, and what ended up having is not only did he lose his kingdom, he loses his life. And they all end up fleeing before Israel. And David, it says, chased them down to the Arameans, and the Arameans never fought with the Ammonites again after that. They completely were done, and there was peace in the land. I think what you can really learn from that is you need to really guard who you're listening to. It's okay, and you should have people in your life you listen to, but those people who are giving you their advice surely better hear from the Lord before they give it. They can share from their experiences. They can share from things. But there's a lot of people giving advice that have no dog in the race. They have no experience. They've never been through it. They're just giving you an opinion. And if it doesn't work, well, I'm sorry. But you have to live out the consequences of that. And you need to know the people in your life are trustworthy and they hear from the Lord. And certainly that you can have conversation, and you should always know the fullness of the situation if you can before you start making rash decisions. So then we go on to chapter 11, and this is the chapter that most people are probably most aware of. In fact, when we're in Israel, they uncovered what they believed to be as David's palace. And there's a portico or a balcony that goes out over the city. You see the foundations for it, that were there. They believe it's the area where David's bedroom would have been, the palace area would have been. It's built into the side of the mountain. And then you can go out and you look over the valley of the city of David, which made the city so difficult to defeat. And so even standing there, one of the thoughts that came to me was, it would have been, when you're standing there, you see everything. So he wouldn't have just seen Bathsheba. He would have seen everybody who was doing anything on top of their house. And Bathsheba, which, by the way, many scholars believe that Bathsheba went out there to get the attention of David from his palace, that she didn't try to hide. And one of the arguments they make is she didn't argue. There is no record of her arguing with the men who came to get her to bring her to the palace. And she didn't resist David. And in fact, when she told David she was pregnant, she didn't try to get David in trouble. that she more than likely wanted David to notice her. And what's interesting is her husband was a Hittite and commander in the Israeli army, which is another thing in itself. Not all of the leaders of the army of Israel came from Abraham. There were other people who had intermarried. They had become part of Israel. They loved David. They wanted to follow David. They came from other nations. So you have, and you see this throughout the chapters we read when it says they were a Hittite or they came from another land, but they were a commander. You had the sons of Zariah and that were commanders. And then you get this guy from Ittai that was also commander of 1/3 of the army, and they're not of Jewish descent, or maybe their mother was Jewish and their father was from a different place, and that would have been of whatever that nation was. They would have followed the father line. So David sees Bathsheba. He brings her to his palace. She's complicit in the relationship. There is absolutely no record that she resisted or didn't want to be part of it. She's with David, could have been for some time, not just a one-thing fling. She had come in, she was with him. She then goes back home, finds out she's pregnant, tells David that. And David knows that there will be public shame, because it's one thing to bring a woman in that has no spouse, but not this woman not only was married, she was married to one of his commanders, one of the people in his army that held position. And his name was Uriah. And he brings Uriah in. He says, "How are things going?" He gives him the report, and he says, "Now go home and spend time before you go back to the battle," hoping that he would go home and sleep with his wife, Bathsheba. And I'm sure Bathsheba was given instructions that you are to do that. Of course, this man being a man of honor, Uriah the Hittite, not Jewish, doesn't leave the palace. He sleeps on the steps of the palace. David gets word that he didn't go home. David asks him why he didn't in the morning, and he says, "Because I would not dishonor you as king. I would not dishonor Joab. I would not dishonor the people I served with until, while they're out in battle and then I'm here, I wouldn't go and enjoy my home." So David, what can he say? David isn't honoring him. David isn't honoring the people who are out in battle. David, however, tries to get him drunk. They have a party. He tries to get him so drunk that he would go home and then sleep with his wife, at least to go home, because now he's intoxicated. And he doesn't. He stays in the palace and then goes. David brings him in the next morning when he heard that he didn't go home, and he says, "Listen, take this letter to Joab." And so he writes a letter to Joab, gives it to Uriah. Uriah gives it to Joab, and Joab opens the letter, and he basically says, "I want this man to be killed." That's what he was saying. Joab knew it. And some of these secrets Joab held over David, but which is why I think he didn't fear David. But David said, basically put him in the more fiercest part of the battle and then pull away from him, which means leave him to die. And what Joab did was, Joab didn't necessarily pull away. Joab put him in the fiercest place of the battle where the best fighters were from the enemy, and many people died, and Uriah was one of them. He put Uriah in a place he knew he wasn't prepared to win, and Uriah was killed. And Joab says to one of the men to send back a message that the battle wasn't going well. And he said, if the king has a problem with how the battle is going because you were so close to the wall, tell him that it's sad, but Uriah, his servant, has died. And David, who would have been very angry about the way the battle was going and probably would respond, because Joab is expecting a terrible response, but he knows if I tell him the Uriah, his response will shift, and sure enough, that's what happened. when he comes back, he says, well, that's what happens in battle. Sometimes you don't win. And David's response changes because he had manipulated the situation to kill Uriah so he could have Bathsheba to himself. And in his mourning of his faithful and loyal servant Uriah, he takes his wife. And you go to chapter 12. When you go to chapter 12, you're now made aware. Nathan, people know. People have seen this. People are knowing this isn't in a vacuum. And Nathan, the prophet, knows what's happened. And David's heart has grown cold, likely from the Lord. Maybe he hadn't even been in the presence. He wasn't in battle. And Nathan comes to David, and he has the conversation the conversation that would have changed everything in David's life. David is a king. Nathan is a priest. And he's got to confront the king. He could be killed. And Nathan goes to the Lord and asks for how to do this, and the Lord gives him this. David should have been, by the way, to battle, but he didn't go to battle. It says when kings go to battle, he stayed back to answer Jen's question that was there. But this is interesting. Nathan basically tells the story. I think what we can learn from this too is the best way to communicate something to someone that needs to be confronted is to have a story where they give their response to the story and then connect it to what they've done. And Nathan comes and says there was a man who had many sheep, and they were prize sheep, and they were wonderful sheep, but he had a bunch of sheep, a very rich man. Then there was another man who was very poor, but he had one sheep, and he valued that sheep. He even slept with the sheep. It was like his daughter. And Nathan says, a friend came to the rich man, and as was customary in the time, they would offer up a meal. So he would go out and he would take one of the sheep and then turn it into, make a meal of it. Well, rather than going and taking one of his many sheep, he went to the man who only had one, took his sheep, killed the man, took his sheep, and then served the sheep for his guest. And David immediately said, as Nathan was leading to what should be done to this man, David was like, he should be killed for what he did. And Nathan comes and says, you have judged your own self. You have judged yourself. This is exactly what you've just done. And when David saw what he had done, he became very repentant. And he says, I have sinned. And Nathan says, and I love this about, he's a merciful God. He says, the Father has already forgiven you. However, the son that it was born to Bathsheba will surely die. And God had forgiven him. And then he says this, he says, but there will be a curse, and the sword would be in David's house, which we'll see in Absalom. When Absalom comes and Ammon, goes after Tamar and all of that. And then Absalom kills Amnon. And then it says his wives would sleep with other men, which is what Absalom did in public on top of the palace. So everyone would know this son that he was having would die and as well. The consequences of that all happened over the next few chapters. In fact, we see it all happening in what we read. So in verse 25, I want you to see something else in chapter 12. If you go to verse 25, all of that happens. David's son dies as God said he would. And then in verse 25, Bathsheba has another son. And I want you to see this because it's an interesting thing I found in here. Then David comforted his wife Bathsheba after the son died, and he went to her, lay with her, and she gave birth to a son, and they named him Solomon. So the name they gave him was Solomon. However, the Lord loved him, and because the Lord loved him, he sent the word through Nathan, the prophet, to name him Jedediah, which means beloved. I've never seen this before. I never saw it before. What's interesting is we continue to call him Solomon, the man-given name. We continue to refer to him as Solomon, and what we know of Solomon is he's incredibly wise, but God had given him the name Jedediah. And what's interesting is Bathsheba and David have this relation out of the worst of circumstances, behavior that was just evil, and yet God blesses them still with a son that he loves, which Jedediah means beloved. So it's really interesting when you think of Solomon had never seen that before. Meanwhile, Joab is getting stronger and showing some disrespect to David as well, and David, he says to David, you need to celebrate the men and the big victories that you're winning. You need to be here. He's almost telling David, you need to follow what I'm telling you to do. And he's getting very frustrated with David in this. And so David goes and does what Joab says, because he's really kind of afraid of Joab at this point. You know, it never says that. In fact, the text even later, it kind of shows, well, maybe David still, there is this tug of war between Joab and David really gets the last say in it as he tells Solomon to deal with Joab, but David's getting ready to die. So, next, Net, the sword will never depart from your house, meaning that there was constantly killing in the house, that there was even amongst the brothers that was happening. I'm looking at a bunch of questions here quick. Alex is in Florida, so if you're wondering where he's at, thanks to Ben, who's in the other room, but informed me he was not going to ask the questions like Alex does. So that's why I'm reading right now. Do we know why David would have stayed back from battle in chapter 11? He's probably getting older. He's enjoying the comfort of his palace. He doesn't want to go to battle and even risk losing his life. So this is another part. We're in chapter 13. And I love chapter 13 because it just shows up. It's like a soap opera, right? David's family is like you're watching a soap opera, and you got these guys over and you can watch it 10 years later and they got the same characters in there and all of this. But if you look back to Jacob's family and the original 12 sons, and before they really became tribes, there was a chapter that just pops up dealing with Judah and Tamar. And it comes out of nowhere, and it kind of demonstrates something in the middle of the whole narrative and where it's at. Then you come to 2 Samuel, and in the middle of this narrative of David's family, you run into Amnon and Tamar. Like, apparently, if your name was Tamar, you kind of were like that obscure chapter that you just got into it somehow. And maybe Tamar read the Pentateuch and said, well, I'm Tamar. I need to get a chapter in there. But here's the deal, what's going on. Amnon, the son of David, sees his half-sister, who's the sister to Absalom. Remember, he's got tons of wives. So all of his sons and daughters to David have different mothers. And so they're all kind of living together, these half brothers and sisters. And Amnon, and there's not a problem with them even like getting together, apparently, because Amnon is never like told he can't be with Tamar. Like Tamar, even in this story, says, let's do this right, as though this was completely acceptable to be with your half sibling. And so it's a little bit different than where we're at culturally. And if you read the law was saying, there was a close relationship, but you weren't to marry in your family. It was called incest. And this is almost the form of incest that was acceptable at that time. And Amnon looked at Tamar, and she was beautiful. And just as Absalom was a beautiful, in fact, when it describes Absalom, it says that he was without flaw. I mean, that's what I think of every time I look in the mirror. I'm without flaw, right? Except I don't have Absalom's hair. It was so thick, he would cut it and it weighed a ton. No, Tamar, like Absalom, her brother, was beautiful. And Amnon was taken by her to the point where he was just frustrated that he would get sick, that he couldn't have that, this is his sister and he just wanted her and he couldn't have her. Well, his cousin, David's brother's son, is friends with Amnon, and he says, hey, you're the son of the king. You get what you want. Here is how you should go about getting Tamar. Pretend you're sick. David will come to you. When he asks how you're doing, if you need anything, you tell him, David, I would love for Tamar to come and make food, but not away from me, make it in front of me. Now, if you're David, you got to be thinking, why? Why Tamar? She is beautiful. And if you're David, you got to be thinking, why does she need to make bread in front of you and then to serve it to you? Why specifically Tamar? So David was either so overwhelmed by other things or just ignorant of what was happening in his own house because he had so many children. He says, okay, Amnon, I'll send her here. And so he sends Tamar to Amnon, and she makes bread. And when she does, he pulls her into bed. He begins to rape her and essentially, or abuse her. And essentially she says, wait, don't do that. Let's make this righteous. Let's go before our father. Let's go before the priest, and we'll make this right. And he said no, because he's so driven by lust for her that he takes her and completely violates her. Then when he's done, and it says this later in verse 15, it says, then Amnon hated her with intense hatred. In fact, he hated her more than he had loved her. Amnon said to her, get up and get out. And she wouldn't leave because she says, you sending me away would be worse than what you just did. See, this is an incredible, this thing that drives, like, I got to have it. It's not just with this situation with a woman, but oftentimes we want a car, and then you get it, and then you hate it because of the things, because it was done wrong. Now, of course, what happened to Tamar was way worse than wanting a possession, okay? It was way worse than some of the things that we want, that we can own. But he hated her because he demonstrated something in him, didn't value Amnon. He lusted after her. What lust does, you lust for something, you'll do anything to get it. Then when you get it, you will hate it. It won't bless you. And when Absalom hears what Amnon does, he does not immediately respond. In fact, Absalom holds it in his heart. He puts it in his heart, and he lets it begin to just build in his heart. It kind of, this vengeance wages in his heart. Tamar now lives with Absalom because she's no longer pure. She's been violated, and for the rest of her life, she lives without ever marrying. Amnon takes from Absalom's sister Tamar the very blessing of her heart, and nothing's done to Amnon. David is angry with him, but he allows him to go on with no consequences. And Absalom is angry. At that point, I think Absalom harbors the hatred of Amnon, and I think he harbors the hatred of his father David for what he had, by not responding, by not doing that. And when you allow vengeance to be harbored in your life, you'll end up doing things you never thought you would do. So Absalom plans to kill Amnon as David mourns. David mourns for this, and Absalom, over a course of time, plans a party. And in this party, he asks his father and the brothers to come to the party. And David says, I can't go, but he begs for his sons, his brothers and David's sons, to come to the party, including Amnon. And so David orders that they all go to the party. They have this party, and while in the party, Absalom tells his men to kill Amnon, and they kill Amnon. And all of the sons of David think that Absalom's trying to kill all of the sons of David so he can have the kingdom. So they get on their donkeys, it says, and they take off for Jerusalem. Meanwhile, David is told by a rumor mill that all of his sons have been killed by Absalom, and he begins to weep. When someone else comes and says it is not true, only one son, Amnon, has died at the hand of Absalom. And then the men come, the sons come on the donkeys, and he begins to mourn the death of Amnon. Absalom, however, he goes into hiding. He goes to a safe place, a city of refuge, and he hides from David until David is ready to deal with the fact that Absalom killed his son. Now, Joab, this is an interesting thing too, because Absalom becomes a problem for Joab. And yet it's right here in chapter 14 that Joab gets David to bring Absalom back into the kingdom. Now, Absalom will later regret this, but it was Joab who brings him in. Absalom welcomes him back, and he says to David, how long are you going to be like this? Just bring Absalom back. And he says Absalom can come back, but he cannot come to the palace. And he invites him back. And Absalom, after being there a few years, says, hey, why am I here? I'd rather have stayed where I was at. And he tries to get Joab to respond. Joab won't. So he lights his field of barley on fire to get Joab's attention. Joab comes and he's like, dude, I'm the one that brought you back to Israel. I'm the one that got your father to even bring you back here. And he says, I don't want to be here unless I see my father. Absalom's heart is still for the kingdom. He wants the kingdom. That's his heart. He wants to be king of Israel. He feels like it's his domain. And so they bring Absalom. Joab gets David to bring him. David kisses him. He restores him. And then he goes back and he stays in his house. Absalom, the man, and this is how he's described. He was handsome. No blemish found him from head to foot. His hair was so thick, it was heavy. And he had 3 sons and 1 daughter who he named Tamar, I'm sure in honor of his sister. And Absalom literally wanted to be king of Israel. And you see that as we get into chapter 15, because it says that David didn't provide for him, but he provided for himself chariots and 50 men. He was ambitious, and he would get up early in the morning. He had a plan for how he would take the kingdom from his father. He wasn't going to wait for his father to decide who would be king. And I think even at this time, Absalom probably heard or maybe knew that he had promised to Bathsheba that Solomon would be the next king. He wasn't going to wait around letting David decide that. He wasn't going to let that be up, and he was going to have more control of what would happen. And it says that Absalom stole the heart of the people of Israel, and he did it by going to them and speaking to what they wanted from the king. And he would promise, well, I'll do this, and I'll do that, and I'll be the one to judge. And they don't have time for you, but I have time for you. And he begins to manipulate the hearts of the people to follow him rather than to follow David. Absalom is very good at this. He's good looking. He's probably charismatic. He's got all of what young David had. He now has David, who had had the kingdom, maybe isn't putting as much time in investing in the people. Maybe he's growing tired and he's not, and he's not as ambitious. And he starts to take his eye off of who he is as a king. And Absalom is right there to take it over. I also think Absalom begins to make friends and alliances with people in authority in David's cabinet. And David either knows it and ignores it, or it's done behind his back. One of which I believe was Saul's son, who David has got eating with him at the table. Because of the response we read later, Saul's son, Ziba, tells us that Saul's son says, no, he's going to get back. He thinks this is an opportunity. He's getting everything his father lost in the kingdom. He's getting it back. That would lead you to think that Meshulbeth, or whatever we want to call the grandson of Saul, Jonathan's son, thought, oh, this Absalom is going to restore my grandfather's kingdom to me. And so he is making alliances, when you read this, with key leaders in David's kingdom. And they're following it. And you see that when they go to Hebron, because a lot of these key leaders go there. They have a system all set up. They said when the trumpet sounds, we need all of these people in these cities to hear that Absalom is now king. People are just living their day-to-day life, and the trumpet sounds, and there are people planted all over Jerusalem and all over these cities that begin to then declare Absalom is king. And even though David had nothing to do with it, everybody buys into the fact that Absalom is king. And it comes to David, and literally David hears from the people that are there, we need to get out of here, because the deception has spread and the hearts of Israel have shifted to Absalom, that they already kind of liked the guy. He was young. Maybe he could relate with them better. He cared for them more, or at least he said he did. He had newer ideas, and David is the old, and we're quick often to get rid of the old, and we bring in the new. And so David and his court leave Jerusalem. Now, it's important to understand that David didn't leave with a small entourage. He left with a lot of people, 1,000 people leaving for sure just from the court. But then you have the sons of David, the family of David. You have even more than 1,000. You have these soldiers that are also going with David. And it says that David, when he left, he had his head covered and he was walking barefoot, weeping. And the advisor, who he had put a lot of trust in, Ahithophel, was left with Absalom. Absalom had really kind of convinced him to stay with him. And this counselor gave David the best advice, and Absalom knew he needed him. And David prays this interesting prayer. He says, will you confuse the advice of Ahithophel? Because he knew that if Absalom had him, he was at a disadvantage. We go to chapter 16. We see the two-facedness of Jonathan's son. Absalom, you see Ziba. He gives basically Ziba all of the inheritance of Saul at that point. And we're coming up. David says, really, what do I have in common with you brothers? This is Joab and his brother. They want to kill this guy who's mocking them. We just see that Joab and his brother are constantly about killing people whenever they don't like something. And David's like, what do I have in? Killing is how you deal with everything. And that's what they have in common. In verse 12, if you look at verse 12 of chapter 16, it's interesting too. If you go there, verse 12, chapter 16, verse 12, I'm fine. It may be that the Lord will see my distress and repay me with good for the cursing I'm receiving today. He is being cursed at the worst moment of his life. Think about this. His son is trying to kill him. His father-in-law tried to kill him. Now his son is trying to kill him. Can you imagine what that's like for David? A man supposedly after God's own heart, And now he's leaving, and one of the family members of Saul is mocking him, and the people with him say, let's go kill the guy. He's like, who can I turn to? David is in a point, I think, very vulnerable at this point. He says, who can I turn to? And he makes this statement. He says, I will endure the distress and hope that God will see what I'm going through and show me mercy. Have you ever thought that when you're going through things that are just create distress in your life, or heavy stress or pressure, and you're going through it, and we're trying to fight to figure out how to get out of it? Have you ever thought like David, where David goes, maybe God will see what I'm going through and he will give me mercy, and that will change. It's an incredible thought and statement. Of course, we know that he sends back Hushai to confuse Ahithophel's advice, and he succeeds in doing that. And when Ahithophel, who in chapter 17 notices that he gave good advice, but Absalom doesn't follow it, this guy had such an identity issue when his advice was not taken, that he went and hung himself, or he knew he had chosen the wrong side and Absalom was already dead. This is an interesting thing, and it's put in there, and I don't know why, because you don't really hear about him until this point. But Ahithophel was a guy, they said, when he spoke, it was as though it was the best advice you were going to get. And this guy gives advice to Absalom, who he's now following. And Absalom asks for the advice of a plant, a spy that David put there, Hushai had put there, and Absalom takes Hushai's advice. And Ahithophel leaves the palace, gets on his donkey, goes home, probably sets things in order, and then hangs himself. And you could say, well, it was an identity. He felt like, I really believe he knew in that moment he had betrayed David and that he would die because he had sided with the wrong side. And what's interesting after all of that, when you see David and he's leaving the kingdom, the people outside of Israel, that David loved David. David wasn't just beloved in the nation. He was beloved by people outside of the nation. People brought him provisions and supplies so that he was able to sustain himself after he left Israel, as Absalom is following him. And I want you also to notice this too. Notice the confusion of all the names and relationships and marriages outside the Israel's family. It's a melting pot. When you read this, what you start to see is intermarrying, which the Old Testament we read with Moses was not to happen, had been going on for hundreds of years. And now people aren't just Jewish, they have Jewish blood, but it's a melting pot of people that are now following Israel and following David. So you see that as you look at the lineage, really Christ comes through the lineage of David, but it involves people of all kinds of nation, which were part of this whole thing. From Rahab, who is not Jewish, to Ruth, who is not Jewish, all part of the lineage of Christ. So when people say, well, Jesus was a Jew, yes, but he also had a whole lot of other nations in his bloodline. I would say that I am German. My dad is German. I have that in me. But my mother was also other things. And so my father was one thing. My mother was another thing. That I have that flowing in me. I have heritage from both places inside of me. And so to say he was only Jewish and didn't have others, he really was not only king of the Jews, he was king of all the nations. And you can kind of see that as he's brought through this. You look at chapter 18. This is interesting. When he left, you thought he went with the small group. Not exactly. Look at this. He had commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. Commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. In fact, 1/3 was led by Joab, 1/3 by Abishai, and 1/3 by who are brothers. Those two are brothers, and the other from Ittai. and he was not Jewish. He came to serve with David. And they were told that when they attacked the armies of Absalom, they were not to hurt Absalom. But Joab doesn't care what David thinks. Absalom is going through the forest of Ephraim. He gets caught up in an oak tree, it says, with his thick hair. The thing that was his greatest strength becomes his weakest weakness. Absalom is encountered as he's hanging by his hair in a large oak tree, which is a crazy picture to think about. Stinks to have nice hair. They informed Joab that the men had seen him there, and Joab's angry that they didn't kill him. And they said, well, you heard the king. He said not to kill him. So Joab can't deny that he knew the king didn't want him to kill him. Joab goes up and kills Absalom without even thinking twice about it. And then doesn't even care what David may do. And we know that David, he knows what David had done in the past, because there was someone who wanted to run to the king, who apparently Ahimaaz wanted to tell the king, and he says, no, let the Cushite do it. And he says, no, I want to tell the king. He says, no, trust me, let the Cushite do it. And so the Cushite takes out running, and later he says, but I want to go run and tell him and he says, fine, you can, I just want to run around. And he says, fine, go run around. Well, he wasn't going to go run around. He was deceiving Joab. He ran faster than the Cushite, and he told David that they had won. But when it came to Absalom, he stopped. He knew David would not receive it well. And he waited for the Cushite to come and tell David that his son Absalom was dead. And Joab knew. That's why he didn't want the Ahimaaz to tell the king about it, because he might end up dead. And so David begins weeping, and Joab in verse 6 rebukes David. He says, these men have fought for you and fought for you and fought for you, and you're going to sit here and weep. You need to go out and you need to tell them that you're proud of them and you're glad. In verse 6, he says, you love those who you hate and hate those who you love. You have made it clear today that the commanders and their men mean nothing to you. I see that you would be pleased if Absalom were alive today and all of us were dead. Now go out and encourage your men. I swear by the Lord, if you don't go out, not a man will be left with you by nightfall. I mean, he comes down on David. He is not afraid of David, and you wonder why he just is fearless. David puts up with a lot of it, but David goes and does what Joab tells him to do. But what's interesting is Absalom had appointed Amasa, and David says, Amasa, you lost, you chose Absalom, but I'm going to make you the commander in place of Joab. And Joab hears about this, and what's interesting is Amasa David says, I want you to get 3 men together, we're going to attack and fight in this battle, and he doesn't do it, and Joab shows up, so Joab and his brother go out and fight the battle, and Joab comes. When Amasa comes back, Joab basically takes a dagger and jabs it into him and says, you ain't taking my position, I'm going to do it myself. And so he takes over and kills Amasa in this place. And what stirred this up was when Absalom became king, the northern kingdom received him with whole heart, thinking they were going to get more rights than they had with David, and they wanted Absalom. And it says Sheba, a troublemaker, attempted to get Israel to follow him. So Judah went back to David after Absalom had become king. I mean, he legitimately became king. And he basically went on top of his house, slept with his father's concubine, 10 of them that David had left back, women of which were put away in confinement, never to really live life again. Not by their choice. They weren't killed, but they were almost put in a prison. And exactly what Nathan said would happen to David happened to David when that happened. They saw Absalom as their king. And so there had to be a re-anointing of David, but the northern kingdom didn't want David. They chose Sheba. And so Joab And David wanted Amasa to do it, but he was too late. So he sent Joab to go, and they defeated Sheba. And an interesting story, what happened with the city, that a woman yelled, "We don't want you to destroy our city." And he says, "Well, throw us the head of Sheba." So they went down, and a few days later came back, threw the head over, and there was no battle. But Joab was so strong in the kingdom that he's like, didn't even let David change the leadership. He says, "I will be the commander." And so David has around him a lot of dysfunction that's going on, and yet God is blessing David in the midst of dysfunction. Listen, you can learn a lot of stuff from all of this, and we need to come to an end. We're past our time. But one of the things you can find is that we want everything to be perfect and think there are no dysfunction. In all of this, David considered to be one of the greatest kings ever to live. But dysfunction was all around him. He made all kinds of mistakes, and yet God continued to bless him. And we make mistakes, but if our heart pursues the Lord, even in the midst of our mistakes, if we come back to God, if we keep our eyes on God, if we, in our distress, look for his mercy and call. It's incredible what God will do in our life as we walk through life. Life isn't perfect. Life is messy. If your life is a mess, you're like King David. And this is such a great book that kind of illustrates that for us. So I want to encourage you, keep going along in this journey. We're going to get through the entire Bible. We're going to do it together. We're going to learn a lot together, and we're going to experience the impact of the life that comes when you're in God's Word. God bless you. We'll see you next Wednesday.